today. It's fine Thursday. Okay, that's good. That's good. All right. And this week we're diving into the last direct prophecy I'm going to be talking about in this Messiah series.
You have to be louder because the music.
This servant series, this Messiah series. So far, we've been introduced to the servant as the person God would use to bring justice and God's kingdom in the world, and Jesus fulfilled that. But he would ultimately be misunderstood and rejected by those around him. And part of the poetry is that while he's misunderstood by those around him, or his own people, he's going to be accepted by the people around the world. So people from other different countries around the world. And that's where it brings us to this prophecy, which is called Isaiah 53, if you've ever read it before. So now we get to this one, and it's a little change of pace because in the other ones, I would read to you what it said and then verse by verse show you how Jesus fulfilled it. And when I would do that, I wouldn't be saying, well, you're a Christian, so you have to believe that. But looking as a matter of fact, this is what the prophet said. And as a matter of fact, this, that, and the other happened in the world because of Jesus. So that's what it did for the last ones. But in this one, it's going to be so obvious, so on the surface, right in your face, that you're going to piece together that it's about Jesus even before I finish reading it. Which is incredible stuff because they've done little experiments, if you will. They bring all these people, they read this thing to them, this prophecy that I'm about to read to you. They read it to them and then they ask them, who is this talking about? And everyone would always say, Jesus. Even Orthodox Jews who didn't realize this prophecy was in the Old Testament, they would read it to them and people say, hey, this is about Jesus. This is New Testament. They've done experiments, then everyone says this is New Testament, not realizing that this was actually an Old Testament prophecy written hundreds of years before Jesus. So that goes to show you, regardless of your background, when people read what I'm about to read to you today, the first thing that naturally comes to mind is Jesus Christ. And it's pretty incredible stuff because we know for a fact that this was written hundreds of years before Jesus, with manuscripts and stuff like that. So, with all that being said, the prophecy actually starts in chapter 52 because it's important to understand that in the Bible, chapter and verse came later. Right? They weren't writing chapter 1, chapter 2 when they were first writing it. That's just the way it is. So the chapter break is artificial. So the prophecy begins in chapter 52, verse 13. Yeah, you see it up there on the screen too. Behold, my servant shall act wisely, he shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. Now this is saying right off the bat that the servant is going to be glorified. In other words, the servant is going to be honored by God, which is a beautiful thing, because the next verses are going to talk about his suffering. So it's neat, right before it gets into the suffering and the pain and stuff, it talks about how he's going to be glorified and honored right off the bat. Then it says, behold my servant at the beginning. The neat thing about that is that it's like a trademark phrase for the Messiah or for the Christ in the book of Isaiah, especially as it comes to a close. So that's how God introduced the servant in Isaiah 42, which is the first prophecy that I read to you. So what that basically all means is, in these prophecies, it begins and closes like a sandwich because God is using the same words to talk about the servant. Alright, so then verse 14, as many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. What that is basically saying is that he was beaten up so badly that you could barely tell it was a human being. You could barely tell his humanity. And that makes sense because if you remember what I read to you last Thursday, I talked about how they were spitting on his face and pulling out his beard, all that type of stuff, that abuse. Well, now it's getting more and more intense. And that aligns with Jesus and his life. In fact, we've gotten so used to the picture of Jesus on the cross that we don't realize how brutal it actually was. You have to understand, in Jesus' day, crucifixion was one of the worst ways to die. It was the most humiliating way to die back then. And before Jesus was even on the cross, nailed to the cross, he was beaten with a Roman flagon. See, that's that whip up there. See, when you think of a whip, you might think of the American slave days with like a leather whip or something like that. But back in the Roman days, they'd have little pieces of metal or even bone and nails attached to it. So every time you would whip the person, and he would take it back, it would rip off pieces of their skin as he would do it. So it wasn't just beating them up, it wasn't just making little cuts, it was tearing pieces of their skin off every time he whipped. A lot of times people died just from that, and that's what happened to Jesus before he was crucified. But it says, verse 15, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard, they understand. Right, but this is where it gets some of the beauty, because even the rejection of the servant, which has gotten more and more intense, right now to the point it's physical and it's violence and it's getting beaten up, even this is a part of God's plan. Because of his suffering and sacrifice, and ultimately his resurrection, millions of people across the world would come to believe in the one true God, like we do here today. Now that's a fact. If you notice, the prophecy says sprinkle. And that's pretty neat. That's why I have a picture of a goat that's about to be sacrificed. He's not actually going to sacrifice it, but he's making a point. Sprinkle. If you know the Old Testament a little bit, you know that before Jesus, the Jews, the Israelites, they had this whole complex system of sacrifice with the lambs and stuff. They would sacrifice animals for their sins before Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice. So that's what this is getting at here too. Leviticus 17:11 is a chapter in the Old Testament. God says he's speaking to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. Leviticus 17:11. Right, so in other words, when you sin, you're the one who deserves to die. You're the one who deserves the judgment. But the animal is going up in your place. That's why it always had to be an animal that was perfect, without any blemish or deformity, anything like that. And because the animal was in your place, when they sacrificed it, its blood would cover you. That's how it would provide an atonement, it would provide a forgiveness. So that's the whole system that they had. And now that's what the servant is going to do. Something that'll go beyond Israel to the nations, people all around the world. It's pretty incredible stuff what Isaiah is getting at here. Then it talks about how kings are going to shut their mouths. So what's all that about? Now, these nations, like I just said, now they're getting sprinkled by the servant's blood. Therefore, the kings and the Gentiles, because a Gentile is anybody who's not Jewish, which I imagine will be most of us in this room. So it's saying these Gentiles, right, these people all around the world, them and their kings, they're going to realize what happened. They're going to realize what God is doing through the servant. Meanwhile, Israel, on the other hand, which is, if you read this little shift in the verses, in the coming verses, meanwhile, Israel rejects the servant. Now, I talked about how that idea has been developing in the prophecies. That gets most intense and the most clear about how the rejection by his own people, but people around the world, they're going to realize what happened. Now, that fits the bill with Jesus. And let me just know real quick.
You want Isaiah 53?
Yeah, Isaiah 53. So that's what we have so far. So that was Isaiah 52, because that's where the prophecy starts. Then we actually get into Isaiah 53:9. Now Isaiah is asking a question. He says, who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Yeah, I know it's not a move on the thing. It's not a big deal. All right, the perspective. All right, so now this is the shift I was talking about, because there's a change in perspective. Before, it was the people around the world who were realizing what they haven't heard. If you think about it, the Gentiles, well, we didn't have the Old Testament, right? Because in the Old Testament, the Jews were God's people. So we didn't have all these prophecies about the servant, but we realized what has been fulfilled in Jesus. People around the world realizing what happened, but the people of Israel, on the other hand, are rejecting it. So that's some pretty incredible stuff that is getting right there. See, now the perspective shifts to the messengers of the servant. You can even think of the disciples when you read this verse, because who's talking? We always read what he has heard from us. In other words, the idea is that ain't nobody's believing what we're saying. And that's the problem, because just in the verse before, we talked about how people all around the world, different countries, and their royalty, they are astonished at what was done by the servant. And in other words, they didn't have this prophecy, but they realized the fulfillment. But the context, now the messengers are saying, who has believed what he has heard from us? The idea is that nobody's believing what they're saying. And the context clearly shows that the servant is rejected by his own people, as sad as that is. And the reason I want to hammer that home is because if you look at Jesus and Jesus' story, he is rejected by his own people for the last 2,000 years, even today. And many Jews, the majority of Jews, think Jesus was some sort of false prophet. And it's interesting, if you look at the history of the interpretation, it was virtually understood, this prophecy that I'm talking to you now, to be about the Messiah. See, but right when you get to the time of Jesus, now it's getting really close to the Christian gospel. Now it's sounding a lot like Jesus. So if you actually look into history, eventually the Jews stopped reading this prophecy in synagogues because no hate against them, obviously, but it started causing confusion, and it sounds like Jesus. So now I would say a majority of Jews, at least a lot of them, don't even know this prophecy is in the Old Testament. It's just interesting, really interesting stuff. And then now there's other interpretations started to come up. But like I told you in the beginning, they've done these experiments where they ask people who's this talking about, and they all say Jesus. So it goes to show, unbiased, when you read it, the first person you naturally think of is Jesus, regardless of what background you come from. Then it says, next verse, where he grew up before him like the young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. Yeah, no form of majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him, excuse me. So basically, he was a breath of fresh air, a spiritual breath of fresh air in this dry desert. Because it's this image of a plant coming out of a dry desert. And the idea is, he wasn't beautiful, he wasn't handsome, the women weren't going crazy over him 2,000 years ago. And you look at Jesus' job before he started what he did, he was a carpenter. So he was a Jewish layperson, working class, not known for his looks or for being this great, rich guy. He wasn't born in a palace, he was born in a manger, all of that stuff. And I think here Isaiah is giving a little jab, because earlier in the book of Isaiah, he talks about how great the servant is, and he's going to be like a royal king, this type of stuff. And we know when Jesus comes back that will happen. But here, as the book is ending, the idea is, hey look, this is the Messiah, this is the servant, but he had no majesty. He didn't look like a king, so he missed them through and through. And the idea is the servant wasn't meeting the expectations of the people. And Jesus certainly didn't meet the expectations of the people when they were looking for what they wanted out of the king. Because they were oppressed by the Romans, and they wanted to start, the government of Israel right then and there, and kill Caesar and all that type of stuff. So then it says, we're getting to the heart of the passage, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquaintance with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. That's verse 3, I believe. So this summarizes what we've read before, everything that we've been reading. If you remember, in the first one that I said to you, there was a very, very interesting verse that says, he will not grow faint or be discouraged until he has established justice in the earth. That's Isaiah 42:4. So in other words, after he has established justice, there's a point where he's going to be faint, discouraged, bruised. So why is that happening? Well, now I've been given more information. Like I said, everything is getting more and more intense. So now we're here in Isaiah 53, and it makes perfect sense. He would be rejected by his own people, and it's that rejection that would ultimately turn physical. The beating, and the crucifixion, and the death. Out of the passage right here, verses 4-6. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, every one has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquities of us all. Do y'all catch what Isaiah is saying here? He's basically saying, hey, the idea is We deserve the punishment. We're the sinners here. But this servant who was sinless, he's the one taking it in our place. The thing is, we didn't even realize it. I'll get more into that in a couple of verses, but I mean, that's the amazing thing. That's the kicker. It wasn't even for his own sins that all this bad stuff was happening to him. It was for the sins of everyone around him that he was going through all this torture and all this pain. So think about in history, who possibly could this be talking about? It's amazing stuff. And the facts of Jesus align with the prophecy. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. Alright, so now this is something amazing right here, because by nature of the servant's mission, what Isaiah said he's going to be doing, you read it and you say, hey, that sounds like Jesus. But in these last couple of verses, he's going to get very descriptive. So now if you actually read it, we can see it actually narrows down who the servant is. And it's pretty cool stuff. Let's see if we can catch it. Oppressed and afflicted. Alright. Well, if you know the Old Testament a little bit, the book of Exodus, you know that at one point the Jews were oppressed in Egypt, and then that's when Moses came in and let the people go out of Egypt. So they were oppressed by the Egyptians. In the same way that Israel was oppressed, now they're on Messiah, now the servant is getting oppressed. The idea is that he's getting abused by those around him, and he didn't deserve it. And like a sheep, it's using images of lamb and sheep. Well, that's neat because, you know, when you're going to kill a lamb, or you're going to kill a sheep, what have you, you know, they don't ask questions. They're not looking around and say, this is what I should be doing. They just do it. So in the same way, the servant was having enough faith and trust in God that he's just going along with God's plan, even though it would be at this great cost. So it is intense stuff. So that is what we have here with the lamb and the sheep and the shearers, that he's just going on faithfully. One neat thing too, it says he won't open his mouth. So did Jesus fulfill this? We have to understand, Isaiah's not saying he's never going to talk forever. I mean, that's silly to think, because I read to you before how it says he's going to establish justice and God's justice and things like that. So obviously he's got to be allowed to speak. What he's saying here is, now all this bad stuff that's happening to him, you know, he could object, he could do whatever is in his power to try to stop it, but he's just letting it happen to him. He's willingly taking it because he's following God's will. He's following God's plan. And that's a good example for us today too. Now, if I bring it to the New Testament in the Gospel of Mark, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, they made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, that was the governor of the day. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so now they're bringing charges against him. So again, Pilate asked him, are you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. So publicly they're accusing Jesus of all these things. His own people are making all these accusations. Now Jesus could have said, no, that's a lie, that's wrong, that's not true. But he was silent. He was silent so that Pontius Pilate, he was amazed. What is this guy doing? What is this guy thinking? By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. So it's pretty clear here, he's going to die, cut off from the land of the living because of oppression and judgment. Now the idea here is oppression from the government, like legal stuff, because the literal translation, he was taken from prison and from judgment, or even he was arrested. So the idea is that he was arrested and he's setting off to be executed. Now, if you take all these pieces together, especially this stuff about, you know, the arrest and the oppression and the execution, it begins to make absolutely no sense apart from Jesus. That's one of the amazing stuff. It narrows it down, you know, so much and so tight that if it's not Jesus, who possibly could it be? And the neat thing is, he talked about the generations. So he's making it a generational thing, meaning whoever this servant is, the people in his day, if they thought he was just dying for his own sins even, nothing special, but it turned out the whole time it was for their sins. And I like the way it's worded because that's a different translation. Actually, that's my verse behind anyway.
Oh, there you go. I didn't hear you say the next verse.
Yeah, so it's got a question mark, see, because different translations say it a little bit different. But I think it's neat because it's almost like God is in disbelief. He says, stricken for the transgression of my people. It's like so shocking. It's like you're realizing it at the same time the verse is realizing it. It wasn't an ordinary God because he was dying for your sins and everybody's sins the whole time. And that's the reality of the situation. And then we can even get into the book of Daniel. Now, if anyone knows Daniel, it's pretty famous because there's certain timelines in it. If you look at what Daniel says, you can map out like days, not days, but years and things like that. And it's pretty incredible stuff because Daniel 9:26, if you look at some of the timelines given, then it gets you right into Jesus' day. And it talks about this anointed one being cut off, like what I just read to you here, cut off out of the land of the living. It's pretty neat stuff because we have timelines, then we have Isaiah saying what's going to happen. That fits like a bill, or that fits the bill, fits like a glove with Jesus Christ. Really incredible stuff. And then it says, Isaiah 53:9, and they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Alright, so did Jesus fulfill this? What the prophet said? Well, if you think about it, when Jesus was crucified, he was between two convicted criminals. They could have been thieves, they could have been murderers, we don't know for sure. But two convicted criminals, when Jesus died, one of them repented and the other didn't repent. So one of them was saved, the other wasn't. But after that, Jesus died. And then it talks this thing about a rich man. And what the heck is this thing with the rich man? Again, this is what I'm telling you guys, that if you really start making it like a checklist and you look at everything that he's saying, it begins to make no sense apart from Jesus. Because let's look at Jesus' life. Who was the rich man? Now, in Jesus' day, there was a man called Joseph of Arimathea, who was part of the Sanhedrin. That was like the Jewish high court, the Jewish council in Jesus' day. So he was a wealthy man, he was well off. But he's important because it was his tomb that Jesus was actually put in. We may not realize that, but it was Joseph's tomb that Jesus was put in that he would eventually resurrect out of. And we know that he was a real guy. We know he was real because one important thing to understand about the Bible is that it's a book made up of different books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So all of them are their own books. All of them are their own documents. And all of them mention Joseph, number one. Number two, it's what historians call an embarrassing detail. So I'll go over this really quick. If I say something like, I killed 10 guys just by looking at them, you're probably going to say, that sounds like a Lord of Horse Crew. But if I say, I read the bed last night, you're probably going to believe me because stuff that's embarrassing when you say it, people tend to believe it because that's how humans are logically. Embarrassing stuff when you tell it is more likely to be truthful than stuff where you're trying to puff yourself up. Now, if you look at the story, it wasn't one of Jesus' disciples who buried him. You know, they were gone. They hightailed it out of there in the intensity and stuff. It was this man who was a part of the people that got Jesus killed. It was him that ended up putting him in the tomb in the first place. So we have this guy, this well-off guy, who put Jesus into the tomb, and inside of this tomb, that he would resurrect. So that's that really neat piece about this really specific thing about this rich man. This is incredible stuff because it narrows it down so much. Alright, verse 10, Isaiah says, it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Alright, so now things are getting happy again. Or a little more, it's like things are going down, now it's coming back up. because this is how the passage is ending now. So, we look at Jesus. The Jewish people, who were God's people, they rejected him in a moment in time. That's true. But here's the beautiful thing about it, is that it was God's plan the whole time. So all credit can be brought ultimately back to God. It was God's plan, it was God's personal desire and pleasure for the servant to go through this, because he was doing it for our sins. All of our the wrong things and all the evil things that we've done in life. So it calls him an offering for guilt. That's really cool if you know about the Old Testament sacrifices, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. Like the dude that had the knife to the lamb's throat, they would sacrifice lambs and animals for their sins. Back in the Old Testament, here it calls him a guilt offering. So we'll say, you can't make it any more clear. This human being, God is going to use to be an offering for guilt, the ultimate sacrifice. Christians, we always say the ultimate sacrifice. This right here is the ultimate sacrifice. And the offspring, the offspring is ultimately the spiritual offspring, or the spiritual children of the servant, of the Messiah. Because you know Jesus didn't have any actual kids. He didn't have a wife, he didn't have kids. But because of Jesus, people all around the world have come to believe in God. So we can put this together in the Old Testament alone. Then when we get to the New Testament, he says, the Apostle John, to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And that's John 1:12. So that's from the New Testament. In other words, because of Jesus, people, it doesn't matter if you were a Jew or not, all people who come to believe in Jesus have the right to become children of God. That's pretty amazing stuff that we shouldn't take for granted. So these are the ultimate children who come to God because of the servant, because of Jesus. And another neat thing, like I'm talking about all this stuff about narrowing down, is that if you read between the lines, it talks about the resurrection. Because at this point, it's pretty clear that the servant is going to die. Talks about he's going to be cut off from the land of the living, calls him a guilt offering, all this different stuff about death. It mentions death by name a couple of times. So it's pretty clear that he's going to die. And then it talks about how he's going to see his offspring. I just explained that, and how he's going to prolong his days. Well, if you die, how in the heck are you going to see your offspring? How are you going to prolong your days? The reality is that Jesus died, but he would resurrect. So his sacrifice was for everybody's sins, but then after 3 days, he would legitimately resurrect. He would be on the other side of death, and that's how he was prolonging his days and seeing his offspring, because he died, but now he's alive again. Incredible stuff, especially if you make this is narrowing it down. Pretty intense. Nobody else could have fulfilled it if you just look as a matter of fact, and you look at the facts. Then, this is verse 11. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see light and be satisfied. By his knowledge of the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. So what this is saying is that the servant is going to be bearing the people's sins. In other words, everybody's sins, they're going to be on him, and he's going to suffer the penalty in your place so that you can be forgiven. That's what's happening here. And if we talk about the stuff about his rejection, which ultimately led him to be crucified, and it's because of his crucified that he made the ultimate sacrifice, it's because of Israel's rejection that the message spread to all across the world. So now we have people all around the world who believe in our Savior, because the own people rejected the message, so then it starts expanding everywhere else across the Roman Empire. That's cool stuff. If that's not the gospel, I don't know what is. Then we get the last verse, Isaiah 53:12. Yeah, this was a long one. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. So make no mistake, the servant is going to die. Well, he was numbered with the transgressors. What that basically means is he was counted as one of the sinners. Everybody's a sinner. We thought he was one of us. We thought he was a sinner, but he wasn't. He was actually making a path to God for us the whole time. So that's what's going on. Again, this aligns magnificently perfectly with Jesus' life. And anyone who's interested, I talked about this prophecy and other things about how, unfortunately, the servant would be rejected by his own people. That's just it was God's plan that things should happen this way. But if anyone who's interested, the Apostle Paul comments in the New Testament, and he's writing to the Roman church, he says, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." That's Romans 11:25. So what he's basically saying is, right now the message, like I said, has spread all across the world, and we have millions of people who are being saved, millions of people who are believing in the one true God. Now, when God determines that enough people around the whole world have come to believe in God and in Jesus, then eventually there will be a revival in Israel. And the ethnic Jews, the ethnic people of God, the ethnic people who are Jesus people, then they will realize that, hey, Jesus, 2,000 years ago, he really was the servant that was sent to us. It's incredible stuff. Give that for a New Testament prophecy right there. So that's what it is, and it's beautiful because it's like a little picture of hope for the future of humanity and people coming to believe in Jesus. So that's why, for us today, the best thing that we can do for Jesus, and if you want to see him come back as soon as possible, as soon as God wills, is to be sharing the gospel, to be sharing the good news with the people around you, your friends, family, people who don't believe, so that all these people around the world are coming to believe in God and in the truth. That's the call to action. I have a perfect call to action because that's the reality. That's what God wants us to do, to advance the kingdom, to advance the message of Jesus. So that's all I have for y'all tonight. All of this stuff is in the Bible for you to read yourself. So if you don't believe me, you think I was lying, you could go into the Bible and read it yourself. The Old Testament prophecy, it's Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament. What I quoted from the Apostle Paul, that's Romans 11:25 in the New Testament. If you think I'm tripping, you can go and look all this for yourself. Because if you're like me, you see this and you think it's pretty incredible. And it's all there for you to look at yourself. So next time, God willing, I'm going to be going more into this and more about how the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. Thank you.